Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest, Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Today we're exploring a topic that's gotten a lot of attention recently, but also has its roots stretching back to the early days of psychology: inner child work. If you're listening to a podcast like ours, there's a good chance that you've heard the phrase inner child before. It refers to the part of ourselves that still carries the emotions, beliefs, and experiences from our childhood. It's a playful, interested, creative part of who we are, a creative part of our personality. But it also might be carrying around some wounds that could be leading to thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that are causing some problems for you these days. Working with their inner child can be very fruitful for people. It can also be pretty challenging. So today we're going to be exploring what the inner child really is, how it shows up in our lives, and some practical ways to work with this part of ourselves. Whether you're already familiar with this or are just skeptical about the whole idea, I think there will be something here that you could get some value out of. So to help us out, I'm joined today, as usual, by clinical psychologist Rick Hanson. So Dad, how are you doing?
I'm great.
I wanted to ask you, Dad, have you done this kind of work with people in the past through your clinical practice? I actually
Oh,
don't
yeah,
know.
a lot.
Okay.
Often it's implicit in
Mhm.
that when we reflect on the mind, it has both breadth and depth. So we explore the breadth of what actually is happening in a person's experience right now. And then we can investigate as well down into the deeper and deeper layers, the hurt that's under anger, or the layers that go back in time to the earliest strata laid down into body memory and emotional memory, pre-verbal memory, based on the experiences we had even when we were really, really young. And so taking those deeper layers into account is inherently a way of working with the inner child, or we might even think of the inner children, because there are many different kids in there and they are at many different ages and stages developmentally. So, one, two, when you do corrective emotional experiences, or what I might call the linking aspect in the HEAL framework I've created, in which we connect positive and, let's say, negative experience together, if you are taking down into yourself helpful, beneficial experiences in the present that are sinking down in and making contact with those younger, deeper layers, that's inner child work too, as well. And then third, sometimes there's a place for personifying the inner child or one of the inner children, and then doing some kind of psychological technique with that. Definitely lots of work in that way.
And I think in your answer, you've already indicated a couple of ways that people might think about what the inner child is, because this
Yeah.
is one of those phrases that has become kind of a fuzzy phrase on social media in the self help world. People use it to mean a lot of different things. So it can be helpful to figure out what we're really talking about here. One way to think about this is that this is just the more childlike part of our current adult personality. This is the playfulness that comes through us, these moments of spontaneous creativity we have, where maybe we're not so bounded to the rules, the regulations, the self-regulation that we might apply in order to be a so-called functional adult working inside of a modern society. So that's maybe one way of thinking
Yeah,
about
if
it.
I could add to that, if
Go
I
ahead.
could, a quality sometimes of innocence
Mm-hmm.
or even naivete that can, get us in trouble if it gets exploited. In addition to a sense of innocence, a sense of a kind of sweetness. These two can seem like aspects of the younger parts of ourselves.
Another way to think about it is that this is the content that we're carrying from when we were young.
Yeah.
And that's how I framed it in the introduction. That's how a lot of people think about this. And this is the stuff that we're still carrying around today. And because we're carrying around it, or because we're carrying it around, it influences how we behave. And it particularly influences how we behave when we're in more stressful situations. And this is maybe more of kind of a developmental approach to psychology. And it's typically how we talk about related issues when we're talking on the podcast. Then a third way to think about this is that this inner child isn't just the result of the experiences that we remember, or if we like look back on ourselves from the perspective of the adult. It is actually a fully formed part of our personality. And that's how people like Richard Schwartz and IFS treat this idea that This is a kind of unique sub personality that we have that is housed within us, and it has its own discrete thoughts and feelings about the world. During this conversation, we're going to kind of fuzz together these three different ways of thinking about the inner child. I think maybe mostly focusing on two and three, but there's probably going to be a little bit of one in there as well. Is there anything else you would like to add here, Dad?
I'd like to build on your second point in that under pressure, people tend to, in the psychoanalytic term, regress. We tend to draw on our go tos, particularly ones that we learned when we were very young. And because of the negativity bias of the brain, they tend to be the patterns that we acquired when we were young, during painful experiences with other people, because the brain is especially biased to internalize what satisfies those three criteria. And so you can find yourself suddenly in ways that can even be quite shocking to yourself, withdrawing emotionally in situations that feel so young. You can find yourself trying to get something from another person that feels very young. It might be presented in a way that seems so rational and believable, but really deep down inside, you're having a tantrum. It's the inner 2-year-old or 3-year-old that's just demanding something from another person that would have been appropriate when you were 2 or 3, but today in adult relationships is not particularly appropriate, and it's not usually well understood by another person. As we explore this, we're going to be, in effect, the opportunity is to look inside and look outside. In other words, look inside at your own inner child material, and also consider maybe people you have a deep relationship with, family figures, even consider people that are really challenging for you, and ask yourself, how are inner child dynamics operating in them too? And can I start to use appropriately some of what I'm learning about healing and nurturing and responding to and making room for my own inner child parts? How can I apply that to being helpful with them, to hopefully enable them to feel better? And if nothing else, enable them to cool some of their jets.
You've given already a couple of examples here, Dad, of how the inner child might show up in our
Yeah.
adult lives. You gave a little bit of an example of repression there, then a
Mhm.
little bit of an example of those under stress, pressurized situations, how that can just pop out of somebody. Are there some other things that people could look out for or be aware of that might give them an indicator that this could be helpful work for them?
Yeah. We can recognize normal facts about how little kids are, which is to say, how we were. And another way into this is to take into account what you know yourself about children. What's going on in them? What are they like? How do they process information? What matters to them? How able are they to cope and to regulate themselves? Which is to say, pretty limited. Neurologically, the regulatory systems in the nervous system, and especially the brain, take 20 years or more to develop fully. And it's simply a fact that young children feel things really keenly, particularly and more intensely than adults do. All that said, when material starts to appear in your own mind, or let's say in other people, that has a particular intensity to it, or a kind of simplicity, either
Mhm.
or kinds of thinking, or seems very concrete, or has a sort of demandingness that's understandable from a 3-year-old or a 1-day old, but is just over the top in a current adult setting. Those are clues right there that younger material is coming forward. Or, for example, if you're in a situation in which, let's say, in an intimate relationship, and here too, the settings that are most likely to evoke inner child material are the ones that were most like how what was around you when you were a child. So I've known people who, when they're in a really polished, high level professional setting, they're functioning full throttle, strictly as a very competent adult. On the other hand, get them into a setting, like let's say a sports team that they're part of, their own basketball team, and they just goof around with friends, or particularly an intimate setting, or maybe they're interacting with the parent of their partner. And suddenly that's like dealing with their own parent themselves. In those settings that, kind of tick those paradigms, suddenly that person is acting really strangely. And sometimes I'm that person, or, or you are,
I
you are
have
that person.
occasionally been that person as well. No, absolutely, totally.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's an indicator as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good there, Dad. Also, if you're somebody who approaches this kind of a concept or an idea a little bit more analytically, you really can frame inner child work through more of maybe a cognitive behavioral lens. So, the whole origin story of CBT is that this guy, Aaron Beck, was a psychiatrist, brilliant guy. And while working with depressed patients, he found that they had what he perceived to be these spontaneous, almost automatic negative thoughts about themselves, the world, or other people. These are where we can find our thoughts and our beliefs. Things like, I'm a failure, nobody likes me, I can't do anything right, they're all just out to get me, that kind of stuff, right? And they would then ruminate on those thoughts, which just reinforced them. And he could call it these cognitive distortions. And he really focused on how can we replace these cognitive distortions with more realistic and therefore generally more positive thoughts over time, which can help people with their depression, help change their behavior. But the thing is that, as we learned over time, these thoughts are not truly spontaneous. They're coming from somewhere. The negative thoughts were based on negative beliefs the person had about themselves or the world. And then when stuff happens to a person, it gets filtered through the lens of those beliefs, which then causes it to be interpreted in a negative light. And we talk about this all the time on the podcast. In our recent episode on anxiety, for example, we talked about how the feeling of anxiety, when it boils up in the body, then causes us to look for something to be worried about in the outside world. So rather than taking outside information and turning it into a feeling, we're taking a feeling and we're turning it into how we're viewing the world around us. And that's why it's a distortion, right? It's not an accurate representation of reality. So, where do those cognitive distortions come from? Where do those experiences come from? They come from evidence, right? Things that really happened to us. And if the things that happened to us yesterday are based, at least in some extent, on the things that happened the day before that, which are based on the things that happened the day before by that, well, you follow the chain back and you get to, hello, childhood for most
That's
people.
right.
So, if you want to, you can think of inner child work as a way of reconnecting with those kinds of experiences and healing the various wounds that a person might have from them and might be understandably carrying around these days. The form that a lot of those wounds can take for people particularly focus on what I'll call unmet needs or unresolved experiences that a person might have. I've gotten a lot of value myself in thinking about different kinds of wants and needs and which of those needs were well met when I was younger versus which of those needs were not well met when I was younger, and how that might have consequences for my behavior in the here and now.
I love how you did the origin story of CBT. And as you know, part of that origin story connects the so-called cognitive revolution, it's sometimes called, to earlier work, such as from Albert Ellis with so-called rational emotive therapy. And even before that, a fair amount of psychoanalytic interpretations are based on surfacing underlying tacit beliefs or views
Sure. Yeah.
for the client, and over time replacing them with more adaptive, more accurate views of themselves, the world, the past, the future, other people, and so on. So that's kind of part one. But I love how you did that. That you're exactly right. There was this way in which, and you see this so much in the history of psychology, that people operate on the basis of the term from literary analysis, and the person who came up with it will come to me in a minute from Yale, the anxiety of influence.
Mm,
His theory was that all writers since Shakespeare in the English language have been grappling with the influence of Shakespeare, and how they manage that influence determines, their work. Do they resist him? Do they try to fly away from him? Do they try to model him and copy him? How do they work that out? Well, you see that in the history of psychology, and the Freudian approach, the psychoanalytic approach, including with Jung, is extremely developmental. It really prioritizes the history.
Yeah. And these days, most people who do CBT
Yeah.
work are very much grounded in that as well.
Yeah, totally right. I'm not taking a shot. I'm just kind of appreciating the contextualizing here. When we talk about these kind of beliefs that come from childhood, let's be clear. First, they're developmentally situated, and the capabilities of a 10-year-old to form beliefs about the world typically are not as cognitively developed as the capabilities of a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old to form beliefs about the world. So those beliefs can become increasingly simplistic and absolutist as we go down the developmental ladder, and they can even be formed non-verbally, kind of visually, even somatically, particularly as we get down to the conclusions, the decisions. Those are examples of beliefs that were made by younger and younger layers in ourselves.
Yeah. And just to add a little, to emphasize
Yeah,
something you're saying here, Dad, never and always are great indicators. If
yeah,
the world is always a certain kind of way or people
yeah.
are never fill in the blank to you, great indicator.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm hearing a typical child voice. You never bring
Yeah.
pizza home. You always break my toys.
Yeah.
Right.
Classic
Okay.
black and white thinking stuff.
Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
that's right. Additionally, and it's in what you're saying, I just kind of want to foreground
Yeah.
it.
Please pull it out.
Wounds, in effect, typically happen because something was done to us, something occurred. And alongside wounds, there are, as you spoke about it, unmet needs. There are lacks or forms of neglect. And that part is really important too. And in my clinical experience, I think, I would have to say that in my own practice, there's more stuff, there's more suffering related to the absence of the good than to the presence of the bad as a
Mhm.
generalization about the population as a
Yeah.
whole.
That's going to vary person to person. But in terms of the population that you worked with, that was more the case. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really worth looking at. Those wounds are hot. We know them, we tend to think about them, but it's very often those neglected needs that then leave us with these unmet longings, which in turn then become often warded off, pushed down, pushed away because they were associated with a lot of pain when we were young.
Yeah, so I would love to get into this in a little bit of detail here, Dad, and maybe give you an opportunity to give some practical examples. Like, what do we mean wound? What do we mean lack? Could you just kind of paint a picture for us here?
Oh,
Oh, and
sure.
also, if we could connect
Yeah.
that to particular experiences that a person might be having in adulthood, that would be great.
I'll give you a couple of examples. One example, a man I worked with for a while who, as best he and I could gather, um, had an early childhood in which his father was pleasant but ineffectual, and his mother was remote and punishing. And that all landed, very important point, on his temperament. So just I want to flag that point in general for people that life happens to a living, vulnerable, sensitive individual who, for genetic reasons, heritable factors, and then also due to the impact of lived experience, um, acquires a kind of temperament that can, for example, lead a particular child to kind of shrug off, no big deal, whatever, it's okay. I didn't like it, but it didn't really land. Experiences, or as a 6-year-old, that would have been devastating for the other child sitting next to them in the schoolroom. So temperament really matters, and this goes to our tendency often, which we could talk about later too, to shame ourselves or be embarrassed about the young parts of ourselves. And as part of shifting in our relationship toward those parts, it's useful to appreciate that, hey, just because other people, even in your own family, like siblings, sort of shrugged it off, it's understandable given your own particular vulnerabilities, how all that affected you. Right. So I think he was also particularly vulnerable to the impact of all this. And then fast forward, when he and I were working together, he was a very successful high tech executive, very capable, managed situations really well. But along the way, his marriage was characterized by, and I know this to be a fact, a very dominating, critical, dismissive, distancing wife. And he would routinely complain about all the things that were missing for him in the relationship. And yet he could not leave her. He was bound to her. People talk about trauma bounding. And sometimes that happens with the actual perpetrator. Often it actually happens later in life in terms of object relations, in which we end up with the person who's a lot like the one who either injured us a lot or neglected us in important ways. And we feel kind of stuck in the script of all that. And so that is an example in which these very young parts of him both were highly dependent on this very powerful female mother-like figure that he ended up marrying, while at the same time being very angry at her, while being utterly unable to insert himself and say what he really felt, because he was terribly afraid of abandonment, which would reenact the abandonment and the exile he experienced very often when he was young.
That's a great description of that, dad. And it also really paints a picture of the kinds of issues that somebody might be dealing with that are not obvious. We can, when people talk about this kind of work and when we wander into the pop psychology world in general, you will often encounter lists of symptomology, people pleasing, perfectionism, feeling triggered by different kinds of stimuli. These can be useful lists. It can be useful to have that as context. But a lot of the time, what happens for people in these real life situations is that it's not so simple. It's not like there is a thing that you can point to that is the thing. Sometimes there is. But a lot of the time, it's fuzzier, it's a little bit more complicated, it's a little bit more difficult to put your finger on. And you're speaking to a whole complex. That's typically the word that's used. A whole set of connected and related issues that are tied to something that appears to lie at some other point in time in terms of its origin. And then, of course, the practical question is, how do we start approaching that? Like, how can we work with something that isn't in the here and now, but instead lies in the past? So most people tend to have two different kinds of goals when they enter this sort of work. First, they want to de-burden themselves from that old stuff that is preventing them from exiting their unfulfilling relationship or is causing them to feel extremely emotionally activated, not in proportion to what's going on around them or to the stimuli that they're experiencing. This can take a lot of steps. For a lot of people, it starts by understanding how their past is shaping their present. Big part of this can be forming a coherent narrative. We've talked about on the podcast a whole bunch in the past. It might include bringing that aspect of personality to light. A lot of people, to use some IFS terminology here, start feeling very blended. They feel like, what do you mean I have a lot of parts? I'm just me, man. And they don't necessarily have the self-awareness to be able to discern the different voices that can kind of pop up in the mind or the different feelings that pull them in different directions. So we get a little bit more acutely aware of that. And all of this lets us make more conscious choices. So if you're choosing to stay in the relationship, it's because you're choosing to stay in the relationship, not because the little kid has, to steal the line from Terry Real, got his sticky fingers on the wheel. Okay, you're making the choices here. But then alongside that, there's also just a lot of good stuff in there. When we talk about inner child work, people tend to focus on wounds. They tend to focus on the negative, on the things the so-called inner child is doing to us that we don't want it to be doing to us. But at the same time, like you were saying very early on, Dad, there's all of this stuff. There's optimism, all of this connection to strong emotions, uh, positive aspects of that naivete that you sort of mentioned in the beginning, even things like mastery motivation. When Jung talked about the inner child, he talked about this being a part of the human personality that wants to develop and become whole. So there's
Mhm.
this like desire, this connection there that can be very powerful if we can tap into it. So we can do both of these things at the same time. We can both try to work with those more negative aspects and then promote the more positive aspects that are tied to it. And I want to kind of highlight that second one because I think it gets lost sometimes.
Well, I'm really glad we're going to be able to talk about that particular part. And I want to highlight a theme running through here. It's really useful to get a good history. And then you go back and forth. So if you're doing this yourself, um, and I'll give you an example for myself. You go back and forth between a sense of something inside yourself that uh, that you're aware of, let's say, or maybe you're just beginning to get a sense of it. If I can use a little metaphor here, in the streaming of consciousness, and as the observer, are observing the flotsam and jetsam swirling along in that stream, sometimes it's as if we observe the stream and there's this little tiny thing sticking up above the waterline, like a little bit of a leaf on the end of a twig. And we go, hmm, what's that? So we pull at it, we start focusing attention there. We start investigating further and we gradually pull that twig, which is connected to a branch, and we get more of a sense of it. Oh, there's some intuition that this is important. That branch becomes the limb of a tree. And then, wow, we start to surface that whole floating log of important inner material, residues of significant lived experience that maybe we were not aware of when we were really quite young. Then that inner work can be really complemented. And sometimes this happens in the context of a therapy. Often we do it on our own. It can be really complemented by a clear eyed understanding of what happened and what happened when, to take that into account. Uh, and then you can kind of go back and forth. Like, I'll give an example. I learned that I was fed on a schedule when I was very young, and my mom was unable to breastfeed, and so I was fed with a bottle. And she told me, a few years before she passed away, and so therefore my middle age. Uh, she said, "Well, when you were little, Ricky," she would call me Ricky. When you were little, Ricky, uh, we were fed you on a schedule, but you cried all the time. So I just kind of threw that book away and fed you whenever you wanted. And I thought, wow, great for you, Mom. And
Yeah,
also,
good call.
what? What? And I could, when she said that, I started being able to access this deep, subtle, but powerful part of me that felt kind of resigned to being unseen, unresponded to, ungone to. Just a kind of a slump, an emotional slump, a sense of resignation, maybe with a little associated anger, but mostly that sense of resignation and despair, even. Wow. And then that's a way to go back and forth. And then that led me to forecast some of the stuff we'll be talking about here. That led me to deliberately visualizing and imagining reparative experiences that I knew did not occur, that I know did not occur, but still are healing deep down, of being that little toddler, that little baby, rather, that little baby, uh, to whom, in my visualization that's healing and reparative, a nurturing parental figure would come with food and love and soothing and all the rest of that, which I could
Yeah.
then internalize into myself. Which was really quite helpful for me. But I couldn't do that until I was able to connect knowledge about the history with internal experience, even extremely subtle, nonverbal internal experience.
I think that's a really interesting example, Dad, because you're talking mostly again about a lack there, something you
In that
didn't
case, yeah,
receive that
that's
that
right.
would have been helpful or might have led to more of a sense of the people around you as really being supportive and caring for you, which could then possibly lead to different experiences as a kid because you're just kind of assuming that people are going to be supportive and caring for you, which then lead to you taking bigger swings, trying things on, have a cascade up through life. That's how we can kind of connect the dots between then and now. So, this is the part in the conversation where we start talking about what to do about all of this.
Yeah.
But because inner child work can be a little fraught for people, you're often touching more vulnerable material whenever you're working with younger parts or exiles and IFS terminology. You could be interacting with some experiences, some memories, even that could be potentially difficult for a person to hold on to. So I'm wondering, Dad, what you think some of the things people should be aware of, or some of the capabilities they should try to kind of develop or think about before they start engaging with this sort of a process?
This will repeat briefly some of the things we sometimes talk about. First point, being aware of internalization into yourself of how you were treated, such that how you were treated way back when can become how parts of you today treat other parts of you.
I think this is a huge point, by the way. Huge
Okay,
deal.
great.
Yeah.
Great. Being very aware of the internalized critic or the internalized pusher awayer, the dismisser, the exiler, uh, the internalized downplayer, minimizer, especially of very vulnerable, upsetting feelings. Being aware of that and really establishing inside the more kind of executive processes of yourself, establishing in yourself a deep kind of loyalty to the inner layers of yourself and that inner child, based on principle, based on understanding, and based on lovingness. You are giving to yourself today, which is so healing, that which could well have been in short supply when you were young.
Yeah. And we learn how to adult by watching other people adult. So we get behavior that's modeled to us, and then we replicate that behavior. That's how the brain works, just bottom
Yeah,
line.
very
So
good.
we've watched our parents as a young person do certain kinds of things to us when we were in that role. And so we learned this is how adults act. So then when we're in adult mind and we are faced by child mind, to put it that way, how do we treat child mind? We treat child mind the way we saw adults act toward us. It's a very natural process. It's really understandable. And it's how a lot of these issues get perpetuated over time because they're not they're not really punished out of us. Like you can't punish your inner child into not doing the things that are bothering you. It's about nurturing the inner child out of it. But that's not a model that people often carry around about how to interact with themselves or even frankly how to interact with kids broadly because it just wasn't taught to them that way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, based on this understanding and based on a kind of allegiance to the younger parts of yourself, a commitment to them, I'm visualizing and imagining a nurse or a physician who's committed to their patient and will protect their patient from the annoying administrators who are saying, oh, denying care, send them home, who cares? Or even worse, inside, the healing setting. It's there needs to be a kind of clarity about the parts of the self that are going to put down the inner child or minimize its needs or laugh at it dismissively or ally with others in your life today who are kind of dismissive of the inner child. And so that's very fundamental right there. Then second, we need to be able to tolerate sometimes the intensity of those younger parts. They can be shocking when we're not used to them. They just come roaring forward. They've been really, especially if they've been really suppressed and have not had healthy opportunities to kind of leak, if you will, and disperse some of that energy. So it's not so intense, when the lid finally comes off. So that's important to be able to soothe yourself and also contain based on what's happening here. And then the last thing I would say is that it's also really important to have clarity that as you said earlier, just because you love the inner child doesn't mean you let it drive the car, as playing
Mm-hmm.
off Terry Reel's comment. And you can know to yourself that you can really open to the volcanic sometimes, passions and intensities and demands of these, young parts of yourself, while taking a breath and tracking your long-term best interests and realizing that something that was completely understandable in a 6-year-old is just not realistic to expect from treatment from others today.
I think also a big piece of this, Dad, is the shame aspect and the
Mm,
embarrassment
yeah,
aspect.
that's right.
Shame is a very primary emotion. It's particularly a very primary emotion for kids. Kids are extremely shame prone. It's one of the earliest emotions that we develop because it's tied to social belonging. And learning how to fit in was an essential survival skill back in the day. You can apply some evolutionary psychology here. It remains an essential survival skill for us these days. It is very, very important. And so when we talk to somebody, you talk to an adult, 55-year-old, sturdy guy about, hey, it's time to work with your inner child.
Mm.
There can be a
Yeesh.
lot of material,
Yeah,
embarrassment. Like, what do you mean? Isn't that way in the past? Like, I don't
yeah,
need to deal with that shit. Like, all of that kind of stuff, right?
yeah.
And those feelings, that shame, that embarrassment, for starters, these are extremely strong emotions that are often quite difficult for people to
Mhm.
process. And then also, they again get in the way of what that part of you actually needs, which is acceptance, comfort, and support. And so it's sort of another way that we kind of turn onto ourselves what was done to us. If other people treated us by embarrassing us or trying to shame us for normal childlike behavior, whatever that was, it's very, very easy again to internalize that and then turn it back on ourselves.
Little point here that a lot of this inner child work is not about the relationship of the child with caregivers. It's about the relationship of the child to siblings
For sure.
and other kids, peers in school. And that's a lot where the real action is. We're getting drawn into doing this work ourselves, just
Hmm.
talking here. Woo. Um, just simply turning toward and being present with the younger parts of yourself is itself reparative, nurturing, and healing. Just the turning toward and um, being receptive. It's beautiful to know that. And in that, how would you be with a little kid who is hurting here as an adult, here and now? Well, can you be that way with yourself? And that's, by the
Hmm.
way, a very useful little bit of a diagnostic skill. Imagine a kid who's X years old, 4 years old, let's say, and who's really disappointed about something, or a kid who's 13 years old and is feeling really hurt about not being included for some party. How would you be with that young child? How would you be? And then ask yourself, how do you want to be with that same young part of yourself, same situation, that same 4-year-old inside or that same 13-year-old inside. And if there's a breakdown, if there's a divergence between how you would naturally be with a real kid like that in your life today compared to how you would tend to treat yourself inside, that's really worth observing and using that insight to help yourself not have a double standard, but to treat the inner children inside yourself much like you would treat outer children today.
This is kind of an example of a word people might have heard. It's called reparenting. It's one of the many approaches to inner child work that's out there. Would you mind kind of explaining what that means, Dad?
It's a broad term. There are people who
Yeah, it's
might
another
use
one
it
of those
more
fuzzy
narrowly.
words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a good one. I think of it
Hmm.
just in terms of face value that we have opportunities to bring to our deeper, more vulnerable, childlike layers, and as well as bring directly to the wounds and the lacks, deep inside the lower strata, of the structure of the psyche. We have the opportunity today to bring to those parts of ourselves what was missing when we were young. That's reparenting in a nutshell. So we can stand up for ourselves. I'll give you an example about myself. For myself, I've realized that uh, hidden, and this is important too, often what is really true in our character as a young child is hidden out of sight for different reasons. Maybe it was not safe to reveal it, to express it. Maybe we tucked it away, even out of our conscious mind, to protect it in like a secret cave. It's still there. It's still part of ourselves, this really important underlying part. And it's sometimes really quite helpful to open the door or to recognize like that was in the mix. And so one of the things I realized about myself some time ago was that as a being, I was naturally a very warm and caring child. But because of different circumstances, I became quite withdrawn and withheld and uptight and in my head and not very expressive of that kind of caring. And so, a kind of reparenting for myself is to value that part of myself. A certain amount of reparenting is about valuing, cherishing, prizing, right? To bring that to ourselves. Anyway, in that celebration, I've been just more able to integrate that truth about myself and to let it be
Mhm.
more natural and woven into the ongoing fabric of my consciousness and my way of being in the world today.
I might be interpreting the word reparenting a little too loosely, even at this point, but kind of roll with me here. I think a big part of this for people can be giving themselves the kindest of experiences these days that a part of them wishes that they had had back then. So if we think about what's life like for most children, and when I use the word children, I mean essentially before the age of like 12 or 13 years old, certainly, but like really all the way up until 18. You are essentially an appendage. You are being moved through the world by other people. Things are always happening to you. And you do have some agency. You get to make some choices. You get to choose, I want to play with this toy rather than that toy. But your real operational agency is pretty limited. You're basically an external organ for the parent that they're schlepping around, all the way to the examples of the kids on those like harnesses and leashes that the
Oh
parents
yeah.
are like walking around or whatever to make sure that they don't, who knows what, run into traffic or whatever it is. Um, but that's really the experience. So the world is big, it is confusing, it's scary, and all of this stuff is happening to you. You get very little choice in it. And then we start talking about inner child work and how do most people initially approach it? All right, well, I guess that my adult self is going to have to dredge up this kid material that's going to be really frustrating to interact with. Ugh, it's so exhausting that I have to deal with this child again. All of that kind of material comes in, right? Again, stuff is happening to that inner child. And so for me, a big part of this, I think, was understanding that there were things that part kind of wanted or wanted to express, and then seeing if I could put my more adult parts or adult self in the position of receiving the communication from the younger part. So it was no longer about dictating to it. It was about putting it in a position where it really could affect the world around it.
Mm.
And that for me was very productive.
Mm.
I'm not sure if that totally connects to what you were talking about, Dad, but just kind of came to mind there. That just overall model that we have of more dictatorial control and what we can do to kind of break it down a little bit.
Yeah, that's very cool, Forrest. It relates to, in a way, four categories here of reparenting. One is in which you are nurturing the younger layers. You're soothing them, you're feeding them, you're nurturing them. A second category is you are celebrating them. You're valuing them, you're prizing them, you're cherishing those parts. Third, really important aspect of reparenting in many people is guiding the younger parts. Because sometimes what happens for different reasons is that we don't get good guidance when we're young and we can become somewhat dysregulated. We're not, for example, comfortable with hard work. We shy away from, mildly to moderately uncomfortable experiences, which are just part of life and necessary to be able to get to the other side to where it's really good. And so there's a place for guiding. And then there's a fourth one I was just thinking about that for different reasons again, sometimes various developmental challenges uh, are not really met, or we don't have opportunities for certain kinds of successes as a kid. That would have been really great to have. We don't have opportunities for social successes or being able to be really instrumental, successful about making something, building something, making something happen, or successful athletically or artistically, intellectually. Uh, and so then as an adult, we look at that young version of ourselves who had a fair amount of, let's say, untapped talent artistically, or untapped talent in terms of being able to be a leader. And then we do the things with our adult mind that set up circumstances and situations and relationships and step by step procedures that enable that younger part of ourselves to have a success, a kind of success that was really not happening when we were
Mm-hmm.
young or maybe in high school. That's a very cool thing. A person listening could ask themselves, what was a kind of unfulfilled capacity or a thwarted success when I was younger? And really, how could I help myself have that kind of success today? And related to that kind of success today, really internalize experiences of that kind of success. So they tap into and go down into those younger parts of myself.
We've talked about this sort of generally so far, Dad, in a way that I hope is helpful for people. And we do, to some extent, need to talk generally because everybody's experience is going to be really different here. And um, for any one person listening, what we've said so far may or may not really overlap with what you individually have experienced. But hopefully, there's something in here that you can find and use to your own benefit. But I'm imagining somebody right now who's going, okay, this all sounds well and good. I can look back through my history and imagine there being experiences in my past that I would get some value here out of doing some combination of reconnecting with and working with and kind of taking the sting out of to some extent, maybe given that inner child inside some of the things that it didn't receive back then. But I look inside and I have a hard time doing what you're describing. Maybe I don't have that kind of self-awareness that you're describing where you can really
Yeah.
hear that younger part. Maybe that younger part's kind of quiet. How do you do this? And that then takes us to something, a particular kind of approach that people can do, which is called voice dialogue, is what
Mm.
at least it was originally called. Dr. Richard Schwartz in IFS, I think, calls this more direct access, where you're trying to directly speak to a part that a person has or allow that part to directly voice how it feels. Do you have much experience with this, Dad?
I have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, so that was a leading question. I know that you've done this a good bit, but like, how would somebody do this?
Oh, wow. That's great. And you can do this in conversation with another person. Uh, be careful.
You can also do it by things like writing a letter,
Yep.
or you can kind of create some distance here if that's appropriate. Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. So the basic idea, and we find versions of this technique, as you know, in things like
everywhere.
Gestalt therapy and
Yeah.
in other forms, even psychodrama, where you deliberately take on different roles. Those are examples. Essentially, uh, these parts of ourselves are imagined as or regarded as subpersonalities or voices. It's very often the sense of them that they are one particular flavor. They are a particular thing, and they have a particular view and they have a particular function. So there's also not an attempt to get them to change. The framework here is to give voice to them. And in the process of giving voice to them, shift somewhat the inner ecology of the mind, the inner equilibrium. So to be specific, this is basically how it's done. So if I were doing it with you, Forrest, so you're
Yeah, sure.
our willing victim here. Okay, good. We would identify the part.
Okay.
And so we don't have to do it for real because it would
Yeah.
put you really on the spot, but we could kind of sort of imagine it.
Sure.
So
Yeah. And I can kind of play a character to some extent. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So knowing you really well, I immediately want to go after a couple of parts.
How
But
about we go after a theoretical listener here, Dad, as opposed to your son sitting in the chair in front of you?
Oh no, well, you were
Much as
willing to
I'm
do it
sure
with
people would
Dr.
love it if you went
Schwartz.
after your son. Yeah, no, I did. So actually, an example of this, if you're interested in this, I recorded an episode
Yeah,
with
that's right.
Richard Schwartz, creator of IFS. He's also a lovely guy. We also talked with him, just the two of us. But in the one that I did with him, he actually did direct access with me. You can find that in the podcast feed. I don't actually know if that's on YouTube or not, because it might have been from before we were doing YouTube videos. I'm not sure, but you can definitely find it in our podcast feed somewhere. So anyways, Dad, go ahead.
Oh, it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
So let's suppose that there's a part of you, typical parts, that is critical of Forrest.
Sure.
Here's Forrest, this great guy, but there's a critic. So
More
I
of a
say,
self-critical part, sure.
yeah, I'd say, so we would say, okay, so is it okay with you, Forrest, if we talk to your critic? And
Mm-hmm.
you would say yes,
I
so we
would
get permission.
self-assess and okay, how does that feel? All right, yeah, sure, cool.
And so then as part of the voice dialogue protocol, I would say, okay, why don't you move literally physically in your chair or on the couch or something and settle into letting yourself be the inner critic. And at this point, sometimes people have a hard time getting in touch with it. Other times it can really feel quite remarkable, as if a whole other kind of energy or consciousness comes in. Now, therefore, this is not something you want to do if you're prone to fragmentation, psychotic process, dissociation. You want to stay away from trauma material unless you're really on top of it. Well, let's suppose that with you, Forrest, very sane, well-regulated person, good reality testing, as we say.
Yeah.
So you'd imagine, okay, the inner critic. So now let's, for example, now we're talking to the inner critic. My role in talking with the inner critic, in the back of my mind, I have a little bit of an agenda because I'm thinking about the role this part of the person plays in the overall psyche of the individual. But I'm also being very careful not to get caught up in that agenda, to try to change the inner critic or push on it, because then it'll go back into the shadows. So I say, well, thank you, first of all, for being willing to talk with me here as Forrest's inner critic. So we would always speak of you in the third person as an important point. Thank you. And are you willing to speak with me? The inner critic would
yeah,
say,
for sure.
Okay, great.
I'm up for that.
Yeah. And I'd say, well, as I understand it, your job in a way with Forrest is to keep him on the straight and narrow, to make sure he doesn't mess up. Is
Yeah,
that
totally.
Yeah. Would you want to add to that what your job is as you see it?
To improve performance, to make sure that there's some safety in there in terms of trying to encourage away from situations that are maybe a little bit more dangerous, particularly kind of social situations, things like that. Or
what kind of trouble do you think he would get into, or does he get into, without your guidance?
well, he can be a little lazy. That's one thing. I mean, he can kind of, he's good from time to time, but tends to fall off in terms of consistent effort over time. That can really be the case. Also, sometimes, gotten some feedback in the past about like talking too much in groups, or kind of just being a little annoying in terms of soaking up a little bit too much of the light in the room, and wow, that wasn't so fun. So really try to kind of make sure that after about 30 seconds of talking, there's a certain amount of, all right, buddy, it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah, definitely. So it
Yeah.
sounds like you're really helpful for him and trying to be helpful for him.
Yeah, I think so.
How do you try to affect him? How do you criticize him?
It's normally pretty verbal. Like Forrest has got like a good internal monologue, and it's pretty verbal in nature. Some people don't have that, but he does. So I can normally just kind of talk to him that way, and come through, strongly enough to get his attention, and then normally he stops. Whatever it is, he's pretty good about it. Sometimes he gets a little sad about it, but it is what it is. And yeah.
Would you be willing to give me an example of being really, let's say, strong, forceful about sometimes needing to get him to do the right thing?
Yeah,
or avoid the bad thing?
sometimes there are days where he just kind of doesn't do anything, or that's how I feel at least. And there's a lot to do,
Yeah,
and man, it's 1 o'clock or whatever, and we just
sure.
haven't produced very much.
Yeah,
And look, like things have deadlines. Like we got a
yeah,
schedule,
yeah.
and when that happens, I will get pretty critical. And I don't think it's inaccurate,
Sure.
but it might come forward a little bit more strongly. And
Do you yell at him?
no, I don't think so. I don't really.
Would you like to?
Oh, sometimes,
Yeah,
sometimes. I think I'm a pretty well regulated part of the system, but there are times where I kind of feel that way. I feel like mad about it for sure.
yeah.
But generally it's more kind of incisive and sort of cutting as
Uh-huh.
opposed to more loud and explosive.
Oh,
Does that make
got it.
sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we'll just be talking here for a few more minutes. So I do want to ask you though. So far, we've been talking about how you criticize Forrest
Hmm.
and keep him on the track, including particularly related to kind of safety issues, avoiding harms, including in social settings or
Yeah, like
related,
bad outcomes. Yeah, like bad
yeah,
things happening.
getting stuff done. You sound the alarm and it kind of
Attention eventually is paid most of the time.
to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a little while, but we get there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe you need to yell louder. I don't know. Or
I ask myself this question sometimes, Rick. I got to tell you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know, but yeah. Okay. So then, what about other parts of Forest? Is there maybe
Mm-hmm.
another part or two of Forest that phew, really frustrates you because you think they're dragging him around by the nose, making him drop the
Oh,
ball, be lazy, or say dumb stuff in social settings? Are there other parts of him that really bug you?
that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about it, but if I kind of think about it a little bit, and I'm a pretty logical part. I
Uh-huh.
really see the goal,
Yeah,
and I want to get us there, and I
I
want to
hear
get
you.
us there as quickly and as safely as possible. Good
Yeah,
goal. So we're going after it. And sometimes there are parts of Forest that are, I think just like a little silly or a little embarrassing or a
mm,
little, exuberant. Take again, like I was saying, like a little too much space in the
yeah,
room. And frankly, my experience is that people just haven't really reacted super well to those aspects.
sure.
And so I try to kind of when those things start going, I try to kind of keep them under wraps a little bit.
Well, you sound kind of frankly really nice about this, and I just kind of wonder if you to try to get your job done
Sure.
would really like those, let's say, other parts of Forrest, those kind of flaky or impulsive or slacker parts of him, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't
Yeah.
you like to kind of give him a good whack or make him go away or
Oh, I mean, yeah, no, they're exhausting.
oh
They
yeah.
irritate me for sure.
Oh,
And like at this point, I think Forrest has gotten to a place where there's a little bit more self awareness about stuff, and we're a little
thanks
friendlier
to
than we
you.
used to be. But
Yeah.
honestly, though,
Yeah.
and I think that there are. Yeah, look, Rick, I think you're kind of right about this. There are definitely ways in which I'm just very frustrated by those aspects,
Yeah.
and I feel like I'm doing all the work,
Yeah.
and they're just running around, and like I don't, who else is going to keep the trains on the tracks here?
Exactly. It's a hard job you have, and it sounds like you don't feel sufficiently appreciated for it.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
At least to an extent.
Mm.
Yeah, we've had sort of a tricky relationship in the past, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've really appreciated talking with you, and I know Forrest has been listening, so
Hmm.
that's really a good thing. And I want to thank you. Is there any last thing you'd like to say before we shift back to Forrest?
No, I mean I think that this was really good. I appreciate it. It's nice to have the stage every once in a while and be able to just kind of communicate some stuff that I feel like I just wish people took it a little bit more seriously sometimes. So
Yeah. The people inside Forrest, you mean?
yeah,
and Forrest himself.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's tough to feel unheard or not listened to, especially when you're right and you know how it ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much. Now let's shift back to Forrest. So,
Sure.
Forrest, why don't you move a little and we're back into the forest.
I was to some extent playing a role there, but there were aspects of truth to it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
totally.
either, playing the role and watching your mind or being in it itself. Do you have
Yeah.
any observations? And I want to
Oh,
totally applaud you, Forrest,
oh,
for how you
thanks.
went
I was
into
willing to
it.
just kind of go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you like got in there, so I was like, all right, hell, sure, we're doing it. So this is kind of an example of direct access or a form of voice dialogue. That was with more of a self-critical part. I tried to throw in a younger part into the part that wants to be more gregarious, present in a room, that kind of thing. And so we got into a little bit of the dialogue that can emerge between aspects of personality. We all have parts of us that want to be a little bit more regulated, a little bit more together, and parts of us that are more like, screw it, man, be who you are. This is very, very natural, normal stuff. But you can imagine doing that kind of thing with those more quote unquote young parts. In some ways, we were actually accessing not so much an inner child part, but a very adult, very hyper manager part.
Yep.
In the IFS terminology, that keeps the trains running, keeps the body regulated, and sort of can suppress those more childlike aspects.
Yeah.
To actually answer your question, Dad, in terms of like in doing it, what is it like? It's really interesting. Initially, when you start doing that sort of stuff, it can feel quite fake initially, or quite like I'm just sort of playing a part here.
Yeah.
But as you get into it, particularly if you're doing it with some, or if you're like writing from that perspective, something people could do by themselves, journaling, things like that, like journaling from a part. Once you get to like the third sentence or the second paragraph, shit gets real pretty quickly. Like it starts to feel pretty legit, pretty fast. Yeah, absolutely. And so you can really get some mileage out of it. I thought it was really interesting how you were talking about how you were validating the part and talking about the concerns of the part, which can then, of course, also help the part chill out a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And for me, I was sort of embodying an aspect of myself that was much more true 10 years ago than it's true right now. Yeah. It was sort of funny when you went to the self-criticism place, because I was like, I've actually done a lot of work around my self-criticism, so this might be interesting. So I kind of like reverted to me circa, I don't know, 2016 or something. But
yeah, that's right. I in totally. My choosing, I didn't want to, get at stuff
like really, yeah.
Totally. Which is appropriate here, and just to highlight some of the how of this. You said a lot
exactly.
Of it
so like, what was happening there?
Yeah,
and people have really liked some of the demos that we've done in the past. So I hope that wasn't too long and that was interesting for people.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Complete validation of the part.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, revving it up a little bit. I think that if we were not in a podcast, if it was not being publicly recorded, and you actually wanted to work on this, I might have done a few things to try to get at more of a kind of harsh, demanding,
more
critical,
yeah, totally,
even punishing intensity in the critic that kind of just doesn't give a damn about how people feel when it drops the bomb of criticism, because its job is to get them to do the right thing, goddammit, once and for all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Totally. And you were very, the critic you were portraying.
And this is also a mellowed out part of me at this point of time. Like that, your results might have varied if we had done this exercise a little while back. But no, totally. And I think that essentially you were speaking to the repressed aspects of the part, which is like a really interesting kind of turn of the screw, like the idea that these aspects of ourselves can themselves have these things that they're pushing down or repressing.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit about the neo-Jungian approaches that have to do with the gods and goddesses within. These different aspects of ourselves in that framework, particularly, in forms of mythology like Mars or Juno or Venus, in like Greco-Roman mythology, or Agni, fire. Each one of those characters is singular. They have a specific nature. They are a particular kind of thing. They're not a composite. They are very very essential. In the same way with subpersonalities, the way to explore them, and especially in voice dialogue, at least classic technique, is to recognize that they are each um, very much their own, very, very much their own. And when you're doing this work, sometimes you'll see people who start slipping out of one subpersonality into another. And it's technically useful to mark that slippage and to go back to the original one until you actually go through the transition where you typically you would go from the subperson. You would start with the core ego process like we did. You'd go to the subpersonality. You'd complete with that subpersonality. You'd go back to the core ego process, and then you'd go out to the next subpersonality if you want to do it. It's actually, in a way, easier to do it in writing where you might imagine a kind of dialogue. Like we might do a dialogue between the critic and whatever we want to call them, the playful child or the
Part.
playful
Yeah.
kid.
The younger
Yeah.
child part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Don't want to do anything. Peter Pan. I
Yeah.
don't want to grow up. Okay. And then you'd have a third character, which is more core process that can make room for both of these voices and subpersonalities, let's say, and is kind of managing and regulating between them and forming balance compromises and so forth. Writing that out can actually also be really helpful.
Yeah. There are a lot of different approaches to this. And if that kind of direct access feels a little thorny for you, understandably, it either feels like it's kind of too much, or you don't really have somebody to do it with, or you're uncomfortable doing it on your own, or whatever. There are a bunch of other ways into this. Visualization practices can be really helpful here. Thinking of yourself as a young person, picking a specific age, visualize them, seeing what they're doing. Can you see them in a room? What's their behavior like? How are they acting? This all itself can be helpful. From that third person perspective, maybe it even slips into a kind of, okay, is there anything that they want to say? Is there anything that they want to say to you? Can you listen to them, giving them that sense of kind of agency and connection and worth? Can you write a letter to your younger self? Can you write a letter as your younger self?
Yeah.
Other approaches that people might have if you tend to be like pretty logical rational, which is definitely where I go, you could explore some aspects of this maybe through art or through play or through other things that tend to kind of loosen up the more logical mind. Uh, I really recommend here, if you're comfortable with them, a lot of somatic practices.
Yeah.
Literally rolling around on the floor can be helpful for people if your body is capable of doing that. Dancing, moving. It doesn't matter if you have no idea what to do. The point isn't that you know what to do. The point is that you're moving your body. Adopting different kinds of postures can be helpful for people. There's this notion called character armor. The basic idea is that we kind of fuse ourselves into a way of holding the body that is representative of more psychological content. So even just doing things like stretching before doing an exercise like this, trying to touch your toes if you haven't tried to touch your toes in 10 years, can, I mean, A, be humbling, but B, can actually literally help you physically get into a different kind of posture that might help these parts be a little bit more accessible. Another thing, if you're somebody who's having a hard time with this, figuring out the reason why you're having a hard time with this is a really big part of the process. For some people, the reason that they're going to struggle with it is because they are very intellectual people, very top down, they're very rational, they're very process driven. I am this kind of a person, so I speak from some experience here. It's important to remember that that is not how a child's brain works.
Very important.
And so when we're trying to essentially go back in time to the feelings or the personality of this younger version of the self, and we're trying to talk to it in this kind of hyper rational, very cognitive way where we're almost trying to reason with the part doesn't the part is not considering context in that way. It is not necessarily thinking about the fact that, mom has a tough job. It just knows that it feels lonely. It's not really thinking about the deadline in 2 days. It just wants what it wants to some
That's
extent.
right.
It can kind of know those things, but they're just fuzzy and not as important as the feeling a lot of the time. And this is sometimes why people struggle when they start trying to reason with their parts in that way.
I'm so glad you said that. And one thing I want to flag too is sometimes what comes out is rage.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Incredible anger. Anger at caregivers, anger at other kids. What's the kind of thing you would yell at the school assembly if you really could with no consequences when you're 12 years old, or yell at others in your classroom, or act out even violently to people toward people who bullied you or abused you, and making room for that. Actually, I don't mind going public with this. As someone who suppressed a tremendous amount of anger as a kid, a lot of my own journey has been finding ways to allow that volcanic lava to come out in ways that don't hurt myself or others, and then release it. That's very important, because anger is the one emotion of the so-called negative emotions, sadness, fear, and shame being the other three of the four. It has a lot of reward in it, and it feeds on itself. It feeds on itself. So be careful with this. But if this is relevant to you, this can be really helpful to let that out. I wanted to add a couple other methods that I've used that have been really
Yeah,
helpful.
please.
Yeah, one is to do what you can to find pictures. You talked a little bit about this already. Pictures, yearbooks, old movies of yourself as a kid, and look at them through fresh eyes. And what do you see? What are the subtleties that you see in the micro expressions around the eyes of the people? What was going on inside you while that kind of picture was being taken? So that's very helpful. And I've had clients come in with pictures going back younger ages, that you can both get a more clarity about the objectivity of what was actually occurring, the facts that can be very useful, as well as get more clarity about what it felt like on the inside. And then another one I want to say is, it's quite an exercise, but if you want to do it, you can do it, is to create an autobiography, uh, or you could even do it third person as a biography of yourself. And you can even structure it year by year by year by year by year. That might seem like too much, especially if you've got more than 20 years under your belt, as probably most of our listeners do. I certainly do. But it can be really quite powerful, or you could do it even by decade. Uh, so you might be writing it in the voice. During the 12th year of my life, after I turned 11, da 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 da. We lived on Fleetwell Avenue in West Covina, doing myself. I went to Hollenbeck Junior High School, and I was in, I don't know what, like the 8th grade. And I da 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 da. I liked doing this. I was scared of that. Like you said about getting into the subpersonality of the inner critic, within a sentence or two, just even the prospect of it, shit gets real. It can get very
Yeah,
real very
for
quickly,
sure.
which is wonderful for you. Be careful about it, but still, it can be really quite powerful. And in it, keep finding the appreciation. Keep appreciating yourself as someone who is coping. Keep celebrating your strengths, so often unacknowledged, unseen, because it's just what you did, just how you were. See if you can keep finding your way into, wow, if I had known that kid who was me way back when, I would have thought I would have liked them. I would have
Hmm.
thought that's a pretty cool kid. Right? Keep helping yourself into that attitude toward yourself.
Unsurprisingly, this has run a little bit long. It's been a longer one of the episodes. It's a deep topic. It touches so much other stuff, and I feel like we could just kind of keep going here, almost endlessly. But I do want to bring us toward a close. I do want to
Yeah.
also ask you one more question, though,
Yeah.
which I think is a really normal thought that people might have as part of this process. There's a kind of balance between the needs or the desires, the wants of this part of ourself, and the reality of now being hello, an adult. And there are times where this part really does kind of need to understand, hey little Ricky, hey little Timmy, hey little whoever. I appreciate where you're coming from, but you got to sit in the passenger seat here.
Hmm.
And that might not feel great, but it is just the reality of life. And I'm wondering about approaching the balance inside of that process and how you've thought about that in general, Dad.
Yeah, excellent. Key question. One part is grieving and mourning and realizing that you will never get back those years and things that were lost, opportunities that were lost, roads that were untaken, doors that you never opened because of all that happened. And the consequences for you will not have been the case. You will never have had a wholly nurturing childhood to the extent that that's true. And so there's a grieving, there's a mourning sometimes that happens when we reckon with, wow. So we need to make room for that grieving, make room for that mourning first. Second, it is really possible to give yourself today to the extent you possibly can, or be on your side today in ways that should have happened more when you were young. And you can reparent yourself today in lots of ways. And as part of that, even if you can't today get the whole quote unquote pie of a completely loving, highly skillful, attuned parenting that's appropriate for a 3-year-old, today you can still get most of the slices of that pie in their adult forms. And you can help those experiences of those existing here and now slices of the pie to sink down into and touch these younger parts of yourself and heal and repair them through processes of linking in various techniques, including voice dialogue, again and again and again. You can also, third, deliberately imagine experiences that you will never have actually had. And yet, as you help yourself imagine them richly, like I did with my story about people coming to me as a little infant with food and comfort and responsiveness, you can help yourself into experiencing that with kind of an adult part of your mind that's, directing the show. But the youngest parts of you that are watching the show or experiencing the show, they have no idea and they don't care where the show is coming from. The experience is real. It's made up, but it's real as it is occurring and can be internalized and received by those youngest parts of yourself. All this is incredibly hopeful. And then I would just say last, uh, in our life today, we can just, in ordinary life, make more room for the goofy, unpremeditated, somewhat impulsive, maybe sometimes a little awkward parts of ourselves, and just make more room for them, and to make more room for playfulness, for curiosity, for adventure, for passion, for all that stuff, that is natural in kids. And we can also make a lot more room for that in other people. And as we make more room for it in them, that makes more room for it inside ourselves.
I thought that was a beautiful reflection. I really appreciate it. And thanks for doing this with me today. This was like really great. A really interesting one.
Well, I love your inner child and I love
Thanks, buddy. I
your
appreciate
outer
it.
adult.
So appreciate it. And it is so funny to have this conversation with your dad to some extent, right? I mean, you saw the actual child. There was no inner about it. And maybe that's a reflection at the end that we didn't talk about at all, which is if you have the kind of relationship with a parental figure that you can have that sort of talk about them, some version of what was I like? What were things like? What do you remember from that? What do you want to tell me about? That can be kind of fraught for people because relationships with families vary. And sometimes the parental figures are the people who caused the experiences that you're now dealing with. Not everybody has access to that resource. But hey, if you do, great way in.
Yes, I know a number of people who've taken we would call them a tape recorder in years past, to talk with their parent.
Yeah.
Or sometimes an older sibling
Mm-hmm.
who has a pretty good recollection of what actually was the case. And, take it with a grain of salt, but it's a nice way in. And sometimes you're dealing with a parent figure who has poor memory or selective memory, or they're motivated in their memory. They want to edit out the number of times they actually spanked you. And sometimes you can be doing this and learn something that just stops you in your tracks.
Oh,
and
totally blows your mind. Yeah.
And you're quietly appalled. Like, what? Like,
But which
really?
might give you a lot of insight.
Yeah,
into
or
what's going on.
even,
Yeah.
how your parent was impacted by other events.
Hmm.
Like what? Dad moved out for a year and a half when I was 2 years old. What? Then he came back and they were married as in my conscious memory. But suddenly you realize all kinds of impacts on
Yeah,
your mother in this example, which then cascaded through your mother to affect you too.
totally.
Yeah. Great.
Man, so much here. We could just keep going, but I got to let people go. Got to let you go. Thanks so much if you listened to the whole episode. We really appreciate it. I really hope you got something out of this one, and we'll talk to you soon.
Beautiful.
I really loved today's episode with Rick, which focused on working with our inner child. So we started by talking about what the inner child is. And there are a lot of different ways to approach this. On the first level, we can think about it as the more childlike part of our current adult personality. This is the part that is more playful or curious, maybe a little bit more sensitive, or the part of us that isn't as governed and regulated by those more top down adult aspects of our personality. Second, we might think about our inner child as the content we're still carrying around from back then and how that content influences how we behave. And this is maybe more of a developmental approach. And then third, we might think of the inner child as a fully formed, unique part of our personality. And this is how IFS or other forms of parts work tend to approach it. It's also how people like Jung tended to talk about the inner child in the psychoanalytic tradition. And the idea here is that this part is its own fully formed aspect of personality. It exists within us as a child. It has its own thoughts and feelings about the world. And because we push this aspect of ourselves away, it tends to pop out when we least expect it and often when we least want it to. Most of the time, when people talk about working with their inner child, the frame is that there's some kind of a wound that needs to be healed, some kind of an experience that the child didn't have, some unmet need, some unresolved material, whatever it is. And we can think of these wounds as anything that's left a mark that's affecting how you show up today. These might be beliefs about ourselves and other people. We talked a lot about that during the episode. It could also be stuff that comes out through your behavior with others, tendencies like people pleasing or perfectionism. A great indicator is if you have a disproportionate emotional reaction to something. In other words, if you're triggered. A lot of relationship issues can show up in this kind of work when people have something of a repetition compulsion. In other words, they're trying to recreate old situations or they find themselves drawn to a particular kind of partner who isn't very good for them over and over again. That could potentially be affected by different kinds of inner child work. So that's normally the frame, working with these kinds of wounds. But another thing that we really wanted to emphasize throughout the episode is all the good stuff that you can get out of this work. Like, it's not just about healing old wounds, it's also about reclaiming aspects of personality that are themselves really beautiful parts of who we are. The interested parts, the curious parts, the parts of us that view the world in a more kind of, I don't know, magical lens, that are a little bit less tied to the monotony of our everyday experiences. Just think about being a 7-year old or being an 8-year old. All of the sense of openness and possibility that a child has. Like, would it be kind of great to reclaim some aspects of that in your life these days? And so we try to do both of those things when we engage in inner child work. On the one hand, we're trying to do what we can in the here and now to repair experiences or repair feelings that we held onto from back then. Then, on the other hand, we're trying to promote all of those positive aspects associated with that inner child. I then asked Rick about what a person needs to develop in order to do this work safely. Because when a person is doing inner child work, they're often touching some of the more vulnerable aspects of their experience: old memories, young parts, things we've pushed away, all of that kind of stuff. And it can really stir up a lot of material. And so you do need some basic self soothing capability here. Another great thing is the ability to let go of the rope, for lack of a better way of putting it. In other words, to be able to cut off your engagement with a thought or a memory and to step back from it without being totally overwhelmed by it. Rick also mentioned how we tend to strongly internalize criticism. We have ways of being with kids that are modeled to us by the adults who are around us. So then, when we become adults ourselves, when we develop more adult parts, we then tend to treat our inner child in the same way that we were treated. We've internalized that criticism and we start to perpetrate it upon ourselves. This means that we then need to be able to regulate those more self critical aspects, those more self critical parts, in order to give the inner child what it really needs, which is that nurturant, accepting energy as opposed to just a lot more self criticism. Then we also talked about working with the shame and embarrassment that can come up for people, particularly if you're an older adult. The idea of going back in time in that way and dredging up the past can, it can feel kind of like an eye roll. It can feel like regressing, been there, done that. And the shame that we carry around today related to those parts, related maybe to things that happened to us or experiences that we had, can really get in the way of what those parts actually need, which is comfort, acceptance, and warmth. We then moved on from there to talking about how to actually do this kind of work inside of yourself. A lot of options here. We talked about reparenting, which is essentially learning how to give yourself the love and support your younger self needed. Rick talked in some detail about that. And then we did a whole role play of direct access. This is also known as voice dialogue. It was created by Dr. Hal Stone and Dr. Sidra Stone in the 1970s. And it's a way that we can give direct voice to our parts. And it can also help us manage the different aspects of personality that we might have in a more deliberate and intentional kind of way. We did this working with more of a self-critical part of me as opposed to, per se, an inner child part. I think that Rick probably chose to do that for a whole bunch of different reasons, including that accessing the inner child of your son in like a public forum in a therapeutic way is probably not super appropriate. So we danced around it a little bit, and I was, to some extent playing a character, but I got to say, most of what I said during that was pretty real for me and was certainly real for me if you had asked me maybe 5 or 10 years ago. If you're not able or not interested in doing that kind of direct access work, which very understandable, maybe you don't have access to a therapist to do that with, maybe it just feels like a lot, maybe you're uncomfortable doing it inside of yourself. There are a whole bunch of other ways in here. One is various visualization techniques that people will do. You could think of yourself as a young person, pick a time and a place, ask them how they're doing. Maybe they want to say something in a room. Just knowing the setting that they're in could even be helpful. And something that I spent some time talking about is the experience of kids, right? Kids feel very dictated to by their parents, by their environment. And so when we just do more dictating to them, when we're engaged in this kind of inner child work, wow, it's no surprise that they don't really want to have much to do with us, or they're pretty resistant to that. So something that can be very healing for people is giving themselves the experiences that they wish that they had had back then. And one of those big experiences is often agency, feeling like they can actually affect their environments, feeling like they can say stuff and somebody will listen to them. So, a great lens for this work as a whole is not can you talk to your inner child, but rather can your inner child talk to you? And can it, at least to some extent, feel like it can actually affect your behavior? There are many other versions of this. There are journaling prompts you can follow. I'm sure you can search for some of them on YouTube, maybe. You can try to write a letter to your younger self. Can you write a letter as your younger self? We can explore this through movement and play, different things that kind of loosen up the conscious mind or get us out of that hyper-rational top-down approach that we often fall into as adults. I'm very familiar with that myself. And something that Rick really talked about a lot was the importance of validating the child parts experience. He really did that with the self-critical aspect of me. You probably heard him say things like, it feels like you're providing a really good service here. You're in a really important role. Isn't it frustrating for you how you need to do this job and nobody else like takes this as seriously as you do? I thought that that was really interesting. And that's also a way that we can approach those younger parts. At the very end of the episode, Rick also talked a lot about appropriate forms of grieving. You're an adult now. It's true. You can look back on your child part. You can have a conversation with it. You can do some voice dialogue stuff. You can reflect on it. You can try to give it what it didn't get back then, and you're still going to be an adult. And as an adult moving through the world that we live in, there's some stuff that you just got to do. And there are some times where that inner child, sorry, it just can't really show up here right now. And of course, we know that. But that's often something that's like a cudgel that we wield against our inner child, as opposed to it being an emotion that we experience as our inner child. there are things that probably should have happened when you were younger that did not happen for you. And there's no going back in time. There's no getting that as the child self. And it can be very appropriate to go through a real process of grief around that. And for many people, as they start to do this work, they can do it in kind of a superficial way. And then they get to the point where it's really about the experiencing out, it's really about the emotional aspect of it. And it's when they're able to do that that they can get down to those deeper layers. This isn't true for everybody. Everyone's journey is going to be different with this kind of stuff. And of course, please be thoughtful and like take some care with it if that's the direction that you choose to go. But speaking personally, that was a big part of it for me. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This was a really interesting one for me. I would love some feedback on the role play we did, the whole like voice dialogue bit. Maybe leave a comment on the podcast in iTunes, Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, that's great. You can just leave a comment down below. Let us know how you felt about it. What did you think about it? Did it seem kind of hokey and over the top? Was it really great and helpful for you to have that sort of an example? Really good for us to know. If you made it this far and you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please subscribe. It really helps us out. If you can also leave a rating and a positive review on iTunes or Spotify, that's really good for us as well. If you'd like to support the podcast in other ways, you could find us on Patreon, patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. For the cost of just a couple dollars a month, you can get transcripts, the old expanded show notes that I used to do for the podcast. There's a ton of great stuff in them. I've been going back through those recently. You can also find Rick or me pretty much everywhere on social media. And again, really, thanks for listening to the show. It means an enormous amount to us. I've just been reflecting a lot recently on what a big part of my life it's become. I feel so blessed to be able to do this kind of work and to have so many people who are interested in it. So again, thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.